Hello, I'm Casey Aiken, and this is 21 This Week. Coming up next, General Assembly poised to override Hogan veto of digital advertising tax. Frustrations grow over delays in COVID vaccinations. Who's to blame for the snafu? And after 3 weeks, how is the new Biden administration doing? Our panel of insiders will give you the story behind the story. We're joined by former County Council member Mike Knapp and the Secretary of the Maryland Republican Central Committee, Mark Uncapher. Stay tuned for these stories and more on the next 21 This Week. Approaching the midpoint in the legislative session of the General Assembly, the House of Delegates on Monday voted to override Governor Larry Hogan's veto of a multi-billion-dollar education reform plan euphemistically called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. Also being considered by the General Assembly is an override of Governor Hogan's veto of the digital ad tax, which critics have argued would impose a tax on protected free speech, discriminate against some businesses over others, and could run afoul of federal laws, including the Internet Tax Freedom Act. And finally, Attorney General Brian Frost wrote that certain parts of this bill and the proposed law may be unconstitutional. Mark, it's not surprising that the House of Delegates overrode Governor Hogan's veto to increase education funding, but is a wise policy, which is what the governor was arguing.
Well, no, it's not, but I almost feel sorry for Controller Francho and Attorney General Frosch because the way the bill deals with a lot of the problems with this legislation is it basically punts to the controller the definitions that are so confused and murky. Does it apply in state? Is it based on IP address? Is it based on where the person is billed? And Attorney General Frosch, who has warned that there are some challenges, some legal challenges associated with this that he as Attorney General will have to defend. So what the legislature has done is basically punted on a lot of the problems with the bill, and others will have to deal with it.
Well, I noticed that the Senate President did pass an amendment to try to salvage the digital tax. And was he successful in doing that? Is it really helpful?
Well, that was one of the more silly provisions to it, which was a provision that said that businesses can't pass on the tax to their customers. Now, would it be nice if, for example, the sales tax, you could put a provision that a business that says you can't pass it on to the sales tax? I mean, I think we all understand that a cost is a cost, and if a business has to pay it, it's going to end up getting passed on. So I think it really was a kind of an exercise in showmanship and not an example of good sound policy.
Mike, I want to shift back and take a look at the education bill that was overridden on the veto. Part of the reason that Governor Hogan argued that the bill should be vetoed last year was that it wasn't fiscally sound. And it wasn't fiscally sound to do so in the middle of the pandemic. We're in no better position now than we were a year ago. So does that make for a good policy decision?
No, I mean, I think we've seen over the last decade or so the challenge that the legislature and the governor have had trying to address the structural deficits that the state has had. And so I think if you go ahead and move forward with the Kirwan Commission without identifying a ready source of funding, you only perpetuate those structural deficits. And ultimately, that just bites everybody in the butt. So I think that's a challenge with it. And so when you look at things like a digital ad tax, which is a mechanism, I think, to identify revenue that can support Kirwan. Again, if you don't know how it's going to be implemented, it's not clear that we'd be the first state in the nation to pass a law like this, that it's even going to be implemented. So if you go ahead and approve Kirwan and override that, and so now you're making commitments from a financial perspective, but you don't even know that you've got a ready source of funds on the other side, I think it then builds a level of expectation that we're actually going to do something real in the education realm. And the reality is the resources aren't going to be there to do it. So I think you've got to have a practical and frank conversation to say, if we have these dollars, we can do these things, but we can't get too far ahead of our skis.
Well, when did that ever good sense and policy ever affect the General Assembly? When I first began hosting the show, we talked ad nauseum about the Thornton Plan and how the Thornton Plan was unfunded, and now we're repeating the same mistake. It just seems that education is such a hot button issue, but they're only thinking of education and solutions in one direction, in one manner.
It's worth noting that the legislature, the state, is only coming up with a portion of, responsible for a portion of Kerwin. A big part of it, as is education generally, is going to be paid by the counties, and so they're going to have their own burden. So the piece that the legislature is scrambling to come up with doesn't even the eye tax only touches a piece of what the overall state portion would be.
Well, right, and the state and the counties, in order to get their state funding, actually have to come up with their individual, their community's funding first. And so, again, you're creating a level of expectation in the minds of our residents and of the state and the counties without really the resources in place. And so now, again, you have to bridge that level of expectation relative to the dollars that we have. And no, Thornton is a great example of that. And we never caught up, and we never fully funded it. And as a result, we never saw the benefits that people hoped we would see. And so we're setting ourselves up potentially for a similar situation with Kerwin. And I think ultimately, who loses? The kids that are coming down the pike who could benefit from increased investment if we actually made the increased investment.
Well, I guess my point to that, Mike, is it's not always about increased investment. I mean, we've had problems in our schools, in a disparity in school and test results and in schooling for the past 50 years. I mean, we may need to look at other means and methods of how we educate our kids, not just throwing money at the problem. Let's go on to our next topic, and that's obviously the one that we talk about each and every week, which is the COVID situation. And the irony of life is that it always seems like it's a good news and a bad news situation all at the same time. Less than a year after the deadly China coronavirus was unleashed onto America and the world, prompting government shutdowns and the destruction of the economy, not to mention destruction of lives, the American ingenuity came up with a vaccine in record time. In fact, it came up with 3 and possibly a 4th in less than a year. That's the very good news. Now the very bad news. Under the normal course of distributions, it will take 3 years for every American who wants to be vaccinated to get one. And here in Maryland, it may even take 5 years. This is how screwed up the system is. Mike, the county blames the state. The state blames the federal government. And everybody seems to want to blame President Donald Trump. And how did we snatch defeat from the jaws of victory of coming up with a vaccine?
Well, I think part of the challenge was that nobody really put a master plan in place. So you look at, interestingly, there have been some stories as to why West Virginia has been so successful relative to how Maryland has operated. And the state said, here's how we're going to do it. Here's our plan for the state. And they didn't leave it up to every jurisdiction to do it. And they also recognized that they should use local distribution point venues like their local pharmacies to be able to distribute, to make sure you're getting into the communities themselves. So I think we have to go back and say, what is our overarching objective? And I think that Maryland and unfortunately Montgomery County have done a bad job of articulating what are our priorities, communicating those priorities effectively, and then really working hard to making sure they gain the right populations. I can tell you right now what Fairfax, Virginia is trying to do, what the Commonwealth of Virginia is trying to do, which populations they're focused on. And I don't live in Virginia. I haven't been to Virginia in a month and a half. But I can tell you what they're doing because they're clear in telling people what they're after. I can't tell you what's happening here in Montgomery County, what our objectives are.
Well, Mark, I read an article in the Washington Post today about the way to game the system, how to game the system in order to get your vaccinations if you're that anxious to get it. I know I've signed up on 3 different websites already. I signed up on the state website, the county website, Giant Food website, Adventist Healthcare website, CVS. I mean, I've signed up on all of them. I've heard crickets. I've heard nothing. So how is this supposed to work?
So you're put into a triage, if you will, that then picks based on the criteria, prioritize who gets the vaccine when. And so as you fall out, as the scarcity of the vaccine is really the determinant here, when there's enough vaccine and your number is up, then you'll be able to get it. So maybe the good news is you're healthy enough that you don't need the vaccine as much as some folks who
Oh no, Mark, I'm
are
sick.
higher up on the
deathly
list.
ill.
But one of the other things,
I'm old, Mark. I'm asthmatic. I'm at death's door. I need that damn vaccine.
Well,
one of
but
the-
that's
yeah.
the issue, isn't it?
But when I think one of the other important parts, though, is candidly, we don't have enough supply right now, and everybody knows we don't have enough supply. And so while there's huge demand because everyone wants it, the supply is still coming up. We're still building up to capacity. And so ideally, we're still in the very, very front stages of this. The jurisdictions are working out the kinks. The states are working out the kinks. The federal government, I think, is giving broader guidance now than they were before. And so as the supply continues to increase, I think, relative to what you were saying, to take 3 years, I think you're going to start to see this really, really kick in another 6 to 8 weeks when we start to see that increased supply.
We all hear these anecdotal stories. Yesterday on the radio, I heard a story about some guy in Virginia who drove 6 hours to North Carolina to get the vaccine because right across the border in North Carolina, they didn't care. And I've heard people who have gone to the states where their vacation home is, like in Delaware, and have been able to get it. Wouldn't it be nice if we just had one registration and they would say, okay, you're going to get it in 3 weeks, or you're going to get it in a month. But at least it would take the uncertainty out of,
right,
and allow people to have peace of mind that they will get the vaccine.
Well, candidly, these are things I was surprised about at the beginning. The one thing we knew everybody was working towards, the federal government was making investment in, was a vaccine. So there was going to be a vaccine at some point, whether it was November, December, February, whenever. So if you know that part's going to happen, why wasn't there real focus on how we're going to actually administer that and put a system in place that provided a standard registry for everyone to go through? There was almost 9 months to do that.
Well,
so
in fairness,
the state that screwed up?
I was going to push back a little bit on that. In fairness, there is this issue, this trade-off of when people don't show up for vaccines, and that it becomes available for people who have, frankly, a lower priority, and better that the lower priority people have it than it goes to waste. So some states that have been more rigorous in, limiting to the scarce vaccines to a smaller group of people have found themselves in some hurt because people don't show up and therefore they end up getting used. Whereas some states that were more flexible, you mentioned the North Carolina example, then they've been able to accommodate more people. So that issue of appointments is a real problem.
Well, we're obviously, I think the good news again is there will be a supply of different vaccines that will be available. And if we are diligent and patient, we'll all be able to get one if we want one. Some people aren't going to want one. When we come back from this short break, after 3 weeks in office, how's the new Biden administration doing? Stay tuned for more of 21 this week when we come back from this short break. And welcome back. After 3 unsuccessful attempts at running for president before becoming the 46th president of the United States, President Joe Biden sure seems like he had a full checklist of items to accomplish in his first weeks in office. According to Fox News, and this was as of January 29th, President Biden has signed 40 executive orders, which have run the panoply of addressing global warming, illegal immigration, and even looking at our military to see whether or not they should be given a loyalty oath. Mark, is this any way to run a government, considering the Democratic Party controls both houses of Congress as well as the White House?
Well, procedurally, I guess this is the Republicans' opportunity to complain about executive orders, which is kind of ironic since for the last 4 years, the Republican president was making a few executive orders. This is part of the process. While and they're not laws, they're reversible, and so many of the orders that Biden has signed have been orders that reverse things that Trump did. Some of which are things that Trump did to reverse orders from the Obama administration.
Well, but I mean, you bring that up, but President Trump attempted to issue an executive order regarding DACA, and that was an executive order of President Obama's, and a district court judge and a circuit court judge, Circuit Court of Appeals, said that he couldn't do that. So they're not necessarily voidable by the successor president. So,
well, you're right. I mean, in that particular one is where you're dealing with the intersection of for law. So an interpretation of the way a law is being implemented. You're in a frankly gray area as to whether or not an executive order can trump an actual statute.
Which doesn't mean that the executive order. Sorry, go ahead.
Some of these have been very controversial. I mean, the first day in office, President Biden shut down the Keystone Pipeline, which by some measures will kill 11,000 or more union jobs here in the United States. And these are well-paying jobs. And I hate saying this, but the response from the White House is, well, they'll get jobs eventually. These guys need jobs today. Why are some of these actions being taken so precipitously is my question.
Well, I don't know if they're being, yes, he did that quickly. The Keystone Pipeline has been far from a precipitous activity. I mean, it was under deliberation for many years under the Obama administration, and then was proceeded forward under the Trump administration. So this has been 8, 9, 10 years in the process. So I mean, there's been a lot of deliberation over that, and I think it's always the tension that's there between environmental protection and jobs, and it's a case can be made in both places. And the challenge I think we always have to address is if you're not doing this, if you're not allowing this to move forward because of the environmental protections you seek to put in place, then what are we doing on the other side to make sure that those jobs exist in another capacity? And I don't, and unfortunately, you take any policy like this, an executive order, and you look at that as one point in time, and that was a thing. And so the question is, when you start to look at that more broadly, what is the overall jobs plan? What's the overall economic approach to making sure that we get not just those 11,000 workers or whatever the appropriate number is, but the rest of the country back to work at a time when we've had millions of people who are out of jobs in industries that probably aren't coming back to the way they were before the pandemic.
Well, I think if you want to look at this but I mean, look, I get the fact that there is a new party in charge, but it also seems from a good government perspective that some of these executive orders didn't think out the consequence of the action. I mean, for example, on the immigration policy, if we are going to reverse our immigration policy, how are we going to treat those people who are seeking to come into the United States? We're in the middle of a health pandemic, and and the idea that we are going to admit people in based on limited claims and veracity of needing sanctuary and asylum without testing whether or not they have diseases, and it seems like we're introducing dangers into our own community.
No, I think that there are always challenges, especially the immigration policy. We talk about immigration policy. The fact that we're doing these, whether it was President Obama, President Trump, or President Biden, are issuing these executive orders that relate to immigration policy, is clearly a failing of our policy making, our legal making body, that Congress, because we have yet to pass a meaningful piece of legislation that addresses immigration. And as a result of that, we're left to trying to do this through executive orders, which I think everyone recognizes is a bad way to address. You just can't address the comprehensive nature of something like immigration through executive orders. And Congress has to undertake real, meaningful immigration reform and actually have this debate. We can't keep kicking this can down the road. It impacts too many people's lives.
And I think I think that's a great point, because I think if you look at what divides us as a country, there is a huge division particularly with over immigration policies.
Mhm.
And one of the driving forces is, a need to have some kind of rational plan that both parties can agree on. It's not that the parties are anti-immigrant, I don't think. The
Right.
party want a reasonable plan as to how it's going to be administered.
In the past, immigration policy has sort of based on some, opening up has been balanced with stronger enforcement mechanisms. So the last major immigration haul in the 80s was what introduced the employer sanctions, and the expectation was that employment verification and then the requirements not to hire illegals would be enough to provide a disincentive. That did not work out. So a new piece of legislation, again, the trade-off is you got to have stronger enforcement that those people who are not entitled to be in the United States, won't be here. And that's been a bridge too far. I mean, that's been one of the challenges for those folks who have wanted a more lenient policy, if you will, is unwilling to accept that. And I suspect too, one of the challenges is when you begin to define who's not entitled to be here, you may find some real division on the part of folks who are support immigration reform or leniency, who really won't accept some of those trade-offs.
And the reality is, I mean, I chair the board of Montgomery College, and you see the impact on the lives of real people every day who live in this state of limbo because they're never sure what executive order is going to be enforced, what's going to be rescinded, and they don't have any permanent status. Oftentimes they were brought here at a very young age, and they're continuing to try and pursue some direction, and they're just kind of out there hoping a good thing happens or a bad thing doesn't happen. And the reality is that we have to put some policies in place, at the very least, that begin to address the lives of those folks who are currently here and have been here for 10, 12, 15, 20 years.
And executive orders have a limit because of the law, where there's only so much that they can do
Right.
in terms of providing a path to citizenship. They basically can stop enforcement efforts, but they can't provide for sort of additional entitlements.
We only have a minute left in this topic, so we really don't have the time to explore what's going on down at the Congress in the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump. I know that there are many that feel that this is vindictive in the part of Democrats, and then on the other hand, there are people who are totally outraged by the events that occurred on January 6th. Since we're in the middle of the Senate trial, we'll address the impeachment next week on our show when we come back next week. Now we have to just take a break here. Time for parting shots. Stay tuned. When we come back, the most exciting, well thought out part of our program is coming to you in 30 seconds. Stay tuned. And welcome back. Now with parting shots. So Mark, on this Valentine's Day weekend, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be moving this weekend?
Well, not exactly. We're going to wait a little bit to do that. But yes, it is Valentine's Day weekend, and my wife and I are looking to get a new apartment, and we're going to be buying it in your offices tomorrow. But I wanted to, as a parting shot, talk about one of the things that the legislatures are fond of doing, and that is pass laws that solve problems that don't exist. And I'm thinking in particular the bill that's been proposed by Senator Will Smith, which is to ban private prisons, that is privately operated prisons or detention facilities in the state of Maryland, which is, have a conversation about that. But the problem is there are none. And there's no effort to start any in there. And so who knows what will happen with that. Why don't we just focus on the real problems we have as opposed to creating ones that we don't actually have?
Well, I think that's a great idea, but whenever that makes sense for a legislature. So, Mike, I'm going to ask you the same Valentine's Day type question. Why is it that government and Montgomery County Council and executive in general can close down a restaurant in 24 hours, but it takes 2 weeks to open it up? And isn't it nice that restaurants are open for Valentine's Day?
It is very nice that restaurants are open for Valentine's Day. And I've learned not being in the legislature anymore, to try and comment on how it takes them so long to make the decisions they do is a good place not to go. However, one of the things I just wanted to shout out is this past week, Montgomery College did a presentation for the American Association of Community College Trustees, highlighting two of the programs they're doing to try and get folks back to work in our community. One is biomanufacturing boot camp that they're working with University of Shady Grove to do, to provide primarily hospitality workers with skills they may need to be able to move into the biomanufacturing jobs that exist in Montgomery County. And then the second is called the BioTrack training program, which is for scientific professionals who are now may need to use different skills as we're doing some of these different things for vaccine development. And so they're providing partnerships with industry and with NIH to be able to provide pathways for them to get those skills. And so it's exciting to see people working together to bring jobs to the community.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mark. I want to thank you both for being here this week on what was supposed to have been a really snowy day. I didn't quite work out that way. Weathermen are only correct about 10% of the time. And I want to thank the audience for tuning in each and every week to Montgomery County's hardest hitting political talk show. For 21 this week, I'm Casey Aiken.